so we were talking about the canon before we left. We talked about what qualifies as acceptable canonical text, not based on our qualifications, but based upon those things which we have figured out or helped us to understand what God's actual canon is, what He has decided to put in His canon by His prophets and His apostles. And so we're going to move on. We've gone through non-canonical texts, which are helpful. These, however, are not helpful. These are bad. Very bad. So we're going to talk about the Gnostics. If you've done any even cursory perusal of any Dan Brown stuff or Da Vinci Code stuff, you've probably heard of the Gnostics. The word Gnostic comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowing or knowledge. And the idea with the Gnostics was they were sort of this, you got to have the secret knowledge. Okay, we've got the secret knowledge. And, yeah, sort of like that. A lot of Rosicrucians, I mean, it just goes on and on. Very cultish. The thing is that they then started developing their own texts and their own interpretations of the Bible. So, in fact, when you get to their basic underlying concept comes from Greek philosophy. In Greek philosophy, with Plato in particular, there's this thing. Have you ever heard of Platonic dualism? If you haven't, don't feel bad. Very random. So Platonic dualism basically has this concept where physical bad, spiritual good. Okay? So the Gnostics took the same idea and applied it to Christianity. So if physical is bad, Jesus cannot become physical. Otherwise, he's taking on bad. So when Jesus comes to the earth, he only appears to be here. He's really spiritually here, but he's not really here. Well, what's interesting is, right at the beginning of the first letter of John the Apostle, what does he say? What was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at, and what we have touched with our hands concerning the word of life. Specifically talking about Jesus. We touched him. We poked him, So he's saying, look, we've seen Jesus. He was here. He was physically here. And John's making in several points in his first epistle an argument against the sort of teaching that was just beginning. How many of you guys have heard of Simon Magus in Acts? Okay, he is the first heretic, basically. In Acts, he's actually baptized, and we don't hear much about him after that. What we find out from church history is then he hauls off to Rome and starts trying to spread a false teaching and false gospel, and it kind of spirals out from there. If you would like to learn more about that, not that I'm doing shameless advertising, but I am doing a little bit of shameless advertising because we don't get paid for it. But if you want to check out our series in 2Gab on church history on our 2Gab YouTube site, we actually go through the development from Simon Magus all the way through all these heresies that started rising up as early as the first century. So Gnosticism, again, the idea is those that know the secret knowledge. It's a mix of Greek philosophy, Eastern mysticism, and this results in two different concepts. And there's different approaches to this because there's different forms of Gnosticism. But then the trick is this. Okay, so how do I live? Do I deny the flesh because it's bad and only do spiritual things in order to elevate and free my soul from this physical bondage? Or do I say, well, the physical has no bearing whatsoever, so I can just be able to indulge in whatever I want? So you get one of two things. You either get the hedonists who just do whatever they want, have as much sex as they want, eat as much food as they want, drink as much wine as they want, do whatever they want because the physical doesn't matter. It's the spiritual. But then the other Gnostics will argue, no, you do all that and you'll affect your spirit. So you need to deny yourself food, deny yourself the pleasures of this world because it'll drag your spirit down. But this is not Christian teaching in the slightest. So these guys come along. Well, naturally what comes out of this is you get texts that they write. So the society comes up with their own cosmology about how the world was created and how the God of the Old Testament's evil and the God of the New Testament's good, and because he's so judgmental in the Old Testament, killing people and sending Israelites to kill other people. And it's bad. But it was seductive because they claimed to have secret knowledge. And in the context of the ancient world, this is a big deal. Secret knowledge, because secret knowledge gives me what? Power. Okay? Magic, or boasted about conspiracy theories of the church. Oh, the church, they're trying to keep us out, man, so they only picked the books that made them look good. It's not what actually happened, but all this begins with Simon Magus. You can check that out in Acts 8. But the earliest church fathers trace the spread of Simon's lies. You won't get this in most other classes you take on heresies or dealing with heresies. But very clearly, the early church fathers traced all heresies back to Simon Magus. They were very explicit about it. This is not generally the teaching you're going to hear in church history. But if you read Irenaeus, if you read Eusebius' church history, which you have available to you in the Ante-Nicene Fathers, and it's got both. Church history by Eusebius, and then Irenaeus is against heresies. But particularly in Irenaeus, because he's actually tracking the development of heresies and why they're wrong, they trace it back to Simon. He's the beginner of this particular vein of thought. All heretics wrote their own works and altered the existing works, but they were not previously known, not circulated, not quoted by the church, not written by eyewitnesses, not in accordance with the prophets or apostles' teaching, nor could they tie back to any prophet or apostle. Do you see the problem? So all these qualifications that I gave you earlier for what determines the canon, none of them could do it. You're going to really love it here in a second. They use names of the apostles. The Apocalypse of Peter. The Gospel of Thomas. How many of you guys have heard of the Gospel of Thomas? Oh, yeah. They love the Gospel of Thomas. I'm going to quote from the Gospel of Thomas here in a second. You're going to love it. These works are only cited by other heretics. They're never cited by mainline church teachers and Orthodox teachers in the church. Eusebius' list includes any Gospel, Acts, or anything else bearing the apostles' name. So, Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Thomas, Matthias, Judas, Mary, Barnabas, etc. Recently, the Gospel of Judas was a big one. Gospel of Barnabas was written during the medieval period. But the Gospel of Barnabas was written by a Muslim trying to prove that Jesus was a prophet, just like all the other prophets leading to Moses. Really interesting gospel to read, but nonetheless, it's late and it's false. So this is honest to goodness, I kid you not. This is a quote from the Gospel of Thomas. Are you ready for this? It's spectacular. Simon Peter said to him, "Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life." Jesus said, "I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." Now, the way this is ordered is they're basically the sayings of Jesus that are in the Gospel of Thomas. There's not really any action going on. It's just Jesus said, this happened, Jesus said. This is saying 114 in the Gospel of Thomas. Does this line up with Scripture? No, of course not. So this is, so when you hear all these people like, oh, Catholic Church has been keeping the Gospel of Thomas from us, it's got the real truth. Because they'll quote especially from one of the sayings where it says the kingdom of God is inside you, which takes the authority away from the church. Whatever. Luke says that too. I don't know why we don't point that out. But oftentimes this is treated as some secret text that the church has kept from us. It's been out there available for years. I don't know what you're talking about. But this is the kind of wackadoo stuff that's in there. There's other stuff in the Gospel of Thomas that's even more spectacular. You can go look it up online. I think 114 is actually the last saying in the Gospel of Thomas. It's not very long. I think it's maybe like 3 or 4 pages.
All right, so ladies, you know what you need to do now.
Yep. You know your responsibility. Got to become like us. Don't know how that's going to happen. But. Conspiracy theories. This is one you'll hear. There was never a secret conspiracy to keep books out of the Bible. Never. This never happened. Okay? All this stuff where, everybody got together and decided, we can't have these books, we got to have these books because this supports our teaching so we can keep our power. Never happened. The history is there for anyone to read or research. It's out there. It's not that difficult to figure out. The history of the church is very well documented, and so are the heresies and heretics. So if you read any of these documents, Eusebius, Irenaeus, Hippolytus, which are available in your Ante-Nicene Fathers and Nicene Fathers text that you got on your e-sword, and we could show you, and actually you want to ask Jeremy where they're at specifically. He knows these fathers better than I do. But if you go and look at these texts, you will find the history is very carefully laid out. You've probably heard the conspiracy theory that basically Constantine called the church together in 325 and said, okay, boys, we need to figure out the canon of this Bible. What books are we keeping in? What books are we kicking out? Never happened. What happened was Constantine called them together because of the threat of a heresy called Arianism, which taught that Jesus was the first created being, not eternal with the Father. And so he called them all together to deal with this issue. While they were there, they confirmed the canon, which everybody already agreed on. So all this garbage about, well, he called them all together to decide what was going to be on the Bible. Didn't happen, and that wasn't even the reason why they were there in the first place. So just be aware that, well, was that 325? 325, 381. The 381 is the second council it meets. And it kind of confirms what the first council did in 325. But that's just not what happened. So, but see, sadly, people will believe whatever they want to believe, especially if it makes them feel better or justified. Hence, there's much deception. And I think this cartoon that Jeremy found was quite funny. Oh, look out, there's a wolf. Get out of here, troublemaker. And yet the wolf's still there. And these guys are very hard to spot sometimes. Unfortunately, what doesn't tickle people's ears, that makes them accountable, that makes them feel bad. Oh, darn, sorry. I forget where in the Bible it says that the whole point is to make you feel good. But this is kind of the concept that Paul gets out in Thessalonians. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains will do so until he is taken out of the way. Then that lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will slay with the breath of his mouth and bring to an end by the appearance of his coming. That is, the one whose coming is in accord with the activity of Satan, with all power and signs and false wonders, and with all deception and wickedness for those who perish because they did not receive the love of the truth. So as we say, this is a really important thing right here. They did not receive the love of the truth. That's why they got led astray. They didn't love the truth. What they loved was what he says next. For this reason, God will send upon them a deluding influence so that they will believe what is false, in order that they may be judged who did not believe the truth, but took pleasure in wickedness. Well, in other places he talks about they'll enjoy the tickling of their ears. This is kind of the state of where people are at. People want to come and feel good after they go to church. Frankly, I don't feel good about a sermon unless I walk away thinking, oh man, I need to not do that anymore. Because I'll tell you, there was a guy that I listened to for a long time. I haven't listened to much of his stuff in a while. Not that he's bad, I just hadn't, by happenstance. James McDonald, who's a preacher up in I think in the Great Lakes area, maybe, somewhere up there. And I remember I'd listened to his sermons years ago, and every time I would walk away so convicted. I don't feel good about myself right now, but I know where to turn. I know which way to go now. I know the correction I've gotten. I'm on the right path now. It doesn't feel good that I haven't been on the right path, but he's right. This is what Scripture says, and got to move on. I'm not there to feel good about things. That's why I get scared when some pastors in Houston are more concerned with making people feel good than actually proclaiming the gospel. Prophet Joe was sure excited when they found out his writings were going to be canonized. Nice. Yeah. All right, so any questions with the canon issues? No conspiracies, folks. They were all well accepted by the church. There were some questionable ones. There's some things they had to figure out, but they were okay with it. Revelation was one that they weren't quite sure about because it's so different than all the other texts. One of the, I think 2 Peter maybe was disputed a little bit. But eventually they all accepted it. They realized, no, this is good. So, and the only reason 2 Peter was disputed was because the style is so much different than 1 Peter. But that's very easily explained because Peter had two different people doing his writing for him between the two letters. So, simple things like that. There's no conspiracy here. So we're all good? All right, session 4, part 2, transmission. So we got these texts. They've been written by these prophets and apostles. Now, how do we go from the original manuscripts to this? Okay? So this is the money part for the day, okay? So, big question, is the Bible sitting in front of you the same as the text that was written almost 2,000 years ago? Absolutely, positively not. Now, stew in that uncomfortable feeling for just a moment. Panic all you want, but it's okay. Again, this is one of those leaves in front of the ants moment, you know. But no, it's not. Those texts were written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, so that's an obvious difference. Those texts didn't have chapter numbers and verses. I'm sure that was obvious. They didn't have section headings. A lot of them didn't have titles. They were just start out, open the scroll, and text is gone. This is not like what we had. Okay, so how do we end up with this and this still be a valid form of the Word of God? So the transmission of a text is a process. And I'm going to walk you through that process today. The better we understand the process, the more confident we can be in it. Okay? I always tell my students with this stuff about Baroque music or the music of Bach and things like that. It's like, if you understand Bach as a person better in the times he lived in, you'd probably appreciate his music a heck of a lot more. Or when we've been working on opera this last month, and I told the kids, I said, look, if you just understood opera better, you'd probably like it better. Just understanding. Don't give me that. Don't. Terribly good stories, and it's. I was so sad because my kiddo got sick. I wasn't able to go see Barbara Seville this week, and I was so disappointed. But all these things that I'm constantly telling them, if you understand the musical timeline better, just understand why music sounds like it does in each time period, you'll probably appreciate it more. Now, I've told my wife that 100 times, and she still hates Baroque music, and I still am thoroughly in love with Bach's music, and Baroque's probably my favorite. But when it comes to this sort of thing, the better you understand it, the more confident you can be in it, and the more you'll probably appreciate it as well. So what is the Bible? A library of 66 books written over a 1,500-year period by 40-plus authors with no conflict between the authors. Thoroughly confluent all the way through, makes total sense, they connect with each other, they don't contradict each other. That was a fascinating sneeze. Which always reminds me, when I was taking counseling course in seminary, there was this guy, it was online, and I felt so bad for her because this video I'm watching is the video that's used every semester for this class for online. And I kid you not, the first time we heard it, I looked at all the students in the video class, I was just like, they're all looking at each other like, is this for real? By the end of class, they're all laughing their heads off. But her laugh, I kid you not. Every time. And the first time it happened, everybody's like, and then by the end of the course, everybody's just dying laughing every time you laugh.
That was the prof?
No, that was just one of the students in the class.
Oh my God.
Oh, it was, I kid you not, I was just sitting there like, what was that? Because the problem is the camera's just focused on the professor at first, and then they'll occasionally do pans around to the class, and they didn't at that time, and even the prof was like, she's got this, I don't know. Oh, moving on. And he's a counseling professor on top of that, so he knows he needs to be sensitive to people's emotions and stuff. It's just like, but I kid you not, by the end of the semester, she knew she had a funny laugh. Everybody was laughing and dying laughing every time she laughed. It was funny. So 39 books of the Old Testament, 5 books of the law. Torah is the word that was used. Torah does not mean law. It means instruction. We in the evangelical community, and a lot of English speakers, we tend to use the word law. Okay? The word is actually instruction in Hebrew. Now, in Greek, when you see the word law in the New Testament in reference to those books, the word is nomos, and nomos does mean law in Greek. Okay, so it's not that that's not the law, but technically the word Torah really means instruction, which is important because if you look at Torah, a lot of it's story. It's not legal code. Okay? So please remember that. History text, Joshua through Esther is all history texts. So Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, all history books. Runs you all the way from Israel entering the land all the way to when they're in captivity. Well, they're not in captivity anymore because Persia has freed them, but they're living in Persia and Israel back and forth. Then you get the poetry and wisdom text. There's 5 of those. Job is technically, even though it's a story, it's a wisdom text. That's how it's considered. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs are our wisdom and poetry texts. 5 major prophets, Isaiah. I'm not going to be able to do all these. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations technically falls in that grouping, although that doesn't, in the Hebrew grouping, it doesn't fall in there. Ezekiel, Daniel, and then the minor prophets. I could do them all, but I'd probably be doing them out of order. But you get the idea. So I feel bad that I can't do that, and I should do that. 27 New Testament books, 4 Gospels, 3 of which are called the Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic means to look together. Optic being look at. Sun in Greek means with, so to look at together, because they all kind of follow the same format. John is very, very different. 1 history text, which is Acts, which is actually Luke part 2. Here's the deal. You have 30, I'm going to get this wrong, but I think it's 34 feet of scroll when you buy it in the ancient world. And when you run out of 34 feet, you're done. And volume 2. So Luke run out of room on 34. It's the longest gospel, Luke. And so he's done at 34 feet and start Acts. So that's as long as you got. And they don't make them longer than that. Pauline epistles, 14. We do at CDI, between Jeremy and I, we include Hebrews. There may be teachers at CDI later on that disagree with that. But based on history and the testimony of history and the linguistics of the text, Paul is the author, even though Luke probably penned it specifically. General epistles, James, Peter, John, Jude. What am I missing? James, Peter, oh, wait. Oh, no, that's right. James?
The book of Judas.
Yeah, the book of Judas, yeah. Same name, Yoda. So it's Jacob, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, John, oh, there we go. And Jude, there we go. And then the Apocalypse. By the way, Apocalypse does not mean end of the world. Okay, it means revelation. Apocalypsis in Greek just means revelation. It's just associated with that because Revelation is the book about the end of the world. So when you say the zombie apocalypse, it's like the zombie revelation. It sounds like some new fanciful book you'd get from Dan Brown, the zombie revelation.
Post-apocalyptic.
Post-apocalyptic, yeah. Post-revelation. So those are the texts we have. This creates the whole library of books. Really what this is a library in one volume. Okay? So then transmission has history. The originals are called the autographs. Okay, this is just a shorthand term we use to describe the actual originals. They're the autographs. Okay, we don't have any of them. We use autograph in a hypothetical sense of what we think the autographs says based upon the evidence. I'm going to show you in a little bit, but we don't have any of them. Prophets and scribes manage the copying of the originals by hand. This is a flawed practice by nature of the fact that you've got to copy. The copying happens in different ways. The first kind of copying is I put a text in front of me, put a piece of paper over here, or papyrus or whatever you use, and I literally just copy it. Okay. Second method is there's someone sitting at the front of the room. All of you have paper in front of you, and I slowly read the text, and you copy it. You get more copies this way. Okay. It's quicker to get more copies. One chapter of Bible takes about an hour to write by hand. So, it gives you kind of a gauge how long it actually takes to write. But these copies that are created are called manuscripts. These are the different manuscripts we have available to us. We have lots of these. In fact, I'm going to show you the evidence here in just a little bit. We have a massive collection of manuscripts, more so the New Testament than the Old Testament, but a massive collection, which helps us know what the autographs probably looked at, because as we analyze the manuscript evidence, we can get an idea of what the original actually looks like. Okay? So the Hebrew Bible is transmitted by something called the prophetic community. These are the community of the prophets. Now remember, just because a prophet's not mentioned in the Bible doesn't mean there aren't other prophets. There was a prophetic community still in Israel at the time. And they are basically the collective group of prophets that managed the scriptures and the codifying of those scriptures over time. Okay? So they handle it. They make sure it's cared for. They're also the ones that update them. The ones that put Dan in Genesis chapter 14. The ones who add Moses' death at the end of Deuteronomy. All these sort of little bits and pieces like that going through and codifying these texts into what their final forms were. This is the group that was part of that process because they were part of the prophetic community. The community that had been chosen by God to speak with us by His Spirit and to handle His texts. The Hebrew Bible was written in Hebrew and Aramaic. Aramaic is a sister language to Hebrew. In fact, the letters for Hebrew that you're used to seeing are actually Aramaic letters. And I'll show you what ancient Hebrew looks like here in just a little bit. But what happened was when the Jews went in, or Hebrews, went into captivity in Babylon, Babylon's primary language is Aramaic. So what they did was they changed the alphabet to the Aramaic alphabet for Hebrew so that they could, it was more easy back and forth between Aramaic and Hebrew for them to read. And I'll show you what the difference looks like here in just a little bit. But the normal Hebrew letters that you're used to seeing are actually Aramaic letters. It's sort of like how we can read Latin letters, but it's a different language, or Spanish. You know, Spanish uses the same letters as English, but it's sort of the same bit where Aramaic letters and Hebrew letters are identical. So if you were open to the portions of the Old Testament that were written in Aramaic, you wouldn't be able to tell if it was Hebrew or Aramaic if you didn't know what you were looking at. So this right here is amazing. This is from the Silver Scroll. It's actually silver there. This is the oldest piece of Old Testament that we have. It's a little fragment here. There's a reverse side. It's called KH1. Bet you didn't see that one coming. This is KH2. So the text of the Old Testament was written sometime between 456 and 400. Okay, we'll talk more about all these datings later on whenever you actually take the Old Testament classes. But Israel comes out of out of captivity in 1446 BC, and Malachi's writing is late as 400. So you got about a 1,000-year span there where the prophets of the Old Testament are writing. Okay, which is pretty amazing because the text of the Old Testament is pretty consistent in terms of language and language usage for about 1,000 years. So the oldest samples we have, like I said, is this, KH1 and KH2. We're not exactly sure which text it is because it's similar to several different texts in the Old Testament. So it's either Exodus 20, verse 6, Deuteronomy 5:10, or 7:9, Nehemiah 1:5, or Daniel 9:4. And then K2 is specifically from Numbers 6:24 and 26. K1's a little harder because the language used there is very similar to a passage that's repeated throughout the Old Testament, these different places. But these are called the Silver Scrolls. And that literally, it's just these. I mean, I can't imagine that they're bigger than this. But these are the oldest copies we have, and they date from about 700 to 650 BC. Very old. But the great thing even about fragments is when you have fragments, that indicates that there was more to it, which means that these texts, whichever one this is, but at least Numbers, is already in place by the year 700. That will be important later on. I may not have the whole text, but the fact that I've got any of it indicates that there was more of it. And particularly since Numbers is part of Torah. Torah was treated as a whole volume. So the fact that I've even got Numbers by this date means that I've got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy by 700. For sure. Okay, so this is Old Hebrew. This is Aramaic letters. Okay? So you used a little aleph, but that's what it used to look like. So when Moses wrote Torah, that's the letter that he used for aleph. So these are very, very different sorts. And you can actually see, if you can see real close, if you can see the letters on there, they're very, very similar. It's what we call Paleo Hebrew, but that's what these look like. And this alphabet is shared by lots of different cultures in the area, too. Now, you don't need to know this. I just think it's something fun to show you. Dead Sea Scrolls. So, in the early 1st and 2nd century, or excuse me, in the 1st and 2nd centuries, a lot of Jewish rebellions against the Romans. Romans ran them into the hills. And there was a community of Jews out there called the Essenes. They were kind of like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, but they wanted to stay separate from the life in Jerusalem because they felt like it had become too decadent, too wild and crazy for them, so they just left. While they're out there, the Romans come marching in. They all freak out because they've got all these manuscripts of copies of the Old Testament, all these different manuscripts. They panic, put them in jars, and take them out into these caves that they've got all over the Dead Sea area. And they seal them. And nobody knows they're there until 1946. And this little bitty shepherd boy's out messing around in the hills, takes a rock, throws it into a cave, and hears, he busted a jar, and he goes in to explore it, and by golly, he finds a whole treasure trove of manuscripts. So in 1947, they start digging these things out in the Qumran area, and I'll show you where that is here in just a little bit, but it's copies of the Old Testament in Hebrew, Paleo Hebrew, some of the Greek texts from the transitional period that we talked about with Maccabees and things like that. Tons of text. Now this becomes really important because the copies were written sometime between 150 and 70 BC. Really, really important because prior to this, we didn't really have that many Old Testament manuscripts to run with. But these are the texts that they had. Parts of or all of. They had all of Isaiah. Isaiah is very famous because they call it the Great Isaiah Scroll because it's like all of Isaiah at Dead Sea. Now they've got segments of it, and you can actually look up online, and I can send you the website, but they actually, there's a translation that's been done of all the Qumran community texts, but all of these texts are represented. Now the cool thing about that is that you have text represented from each of the sections of the Old Testament, which means you have the total volume of each of those sections available during this time as well. which is very important because that shows evidence of how earlier these texts or how early these texts are. Now, not as early as the Silver Scrolls I showed you, but definitely earlier than some people give them credit for. So here's the Dead Sea. So these were found right here toward the north, but it's now it's in Penn National Park. And they just discovered a 12th cave here recently that they have now had to excavate. And so we don't know what kind of manuscripts they're going to find down there too. So this is still very much an ongoing process. So something that happened during the middle of the 3rd century BC is this Greek guy, Ptolemy Philadelphus, got the idea that he wanted a copy of the Old Testament in Greek. So what he did was he got a bunch of Hebrew scholars together and had them translated. He gave them all these resources in Alexandria, Egypt. What's Alexandria known for?
Trade, education.
Well, okay, there's the harbor for sure. What else?
Trade.
What?
No, I was thinking it was trade.
Okay, there is a big trade thing's a big deal because it's a distribution point. But one other thing big there,
Didn't they have a big library?
the library, yeah. Now the reason why the library is so important there is because the arid climate there kept the manuscripts from breaking down from moisture. It's one of the reasons why the library was there. And so they had access to all that. So they go in and they start. They're done translating Torah by late, like 225-ish, somewhere in there, I think, BC. I can be corrected easily on that. And then later on, they finished translating off the rest of it. But this became, I did not realize this, this was the first major document in the ancient world to ever be translated into another language. Ever. Not only that, but this was the New Testament community's Bible. Because you have to remember, they're Greek speaking, they're not Hebrew speaking, and they can't read Hebrew. A lot of those early Christians. Because they're either Hellenized Jews, which means they're Greekized Jews, if you will, or they're Gentile Christians who can read Greek and speak Greek, but they don't know Hebrew. That was their Bible. Okay? So, very, very important document here, but I'm going to show you why it's particularly important here in just a little bit. Remember, the date on this is about 250-ish. 250 to 150 is about when it was all completed. 225-ish, I think, is when Torah was finally completed, but the rest of it came on a little bit later on. Now, the Masoretes were a family of Jews who came along later, after Jesus' time, and they were dedicated scribes. They had a very meticulous process, and I wish the Christians had followed their meticulous process because it seems like the Christians did not do a particularly good job of making sure there were not as many mistakes in their texts. The Masoretes were so specific that they would count the number of letters on a page, and if the letters didn't match up in the manuscript, gone. So it had to match precisely. They had a very, very strict policy. But it's the whole Hebrew Old Testament. We have tons of Masoretic texts. But here's the problem. Do you notice when the date is?
80.
It is 80. It's 950. This is the earliest. Here's the thing. The Masoretic text of the Hebrew is the earliest copy of the complete Hebrew Old Testament that we have. 8 centuries after the New Testament. It's a little bit of difficulty. But the cool thing is that when the Qumran documents were discovered, very little difference between the Qumran documents that came along over 1,000 years earlier and that text. So very well preserved, mind you, but and don't get me wrong, they have a lot of the Hebrew text back in Qumran, but they don't have the whole the earliest copy we have of literally Genesis all the way to Malachi complete is the Masoretic text. The Leningrad Codex is usually what you'll hear referred to as. But these copies are nearly identical to what's available from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which tells us that the transmission history has been fantastic for the Hebrew. Now, the one thing that we do have to be very careful of is when we look at the differences between the Hebrew manuscripts, the Greek manuscripts, because remember, the oldest copies we have of the complete Old Testament are Greek, they're not Hebrew. So when we see a difference between the way the Hebrew text reads from 950 AD and the way the Greek text from 200 BC reads, what's the problem there?
It's a lot of time.
Well, it's a lot of time, but here's the thing. This Greek text was based on what?
A copy. Ancient Greek.
Well, it is an ancient Greek, yeah. But this ancient Greek copy is based on a what?
It's a copy
Of which version?
Hebrew.
Of the Hebrew, right. The Hebrew text that was the basis for this Greek text is it older or younger than this one over here? Because this is our 950 AD, and here's our 200 BC Greek text. Okay, do you see the problem? The only problem is we don't have the Hebrew text that this Greek text was based on. See the problem? So the problem for us is trying. Yeah. So the problem we have is when we see a difference between the 950 AD copy of the Hebrew Masoretic text, and it reads different in the Greek translation from over 1,000 years earlier. What do we do? And that's kind of the art and science that we're going to talk about when we get to textual criticism. But that's why we still need to pay attention to the Greek text, because it represents a different version of the Hebrew text than we may be used to. Now, not different wholesale, okay? I'm just talking every once in a while there's little differences in the manuscripts, and it helps us to kind of catch those.
How much had the language evolved? I mean, you're looking at almost 1,000 years of language.
Yeah. So here's the thing. Comparing it to English is not a good idea.
Okay.
English has changed. English didn't even really exist in any really helpful form until the medieval period, and it's evolved tremendously. I mean, try reading Beowulf in the original English. Okay, it's or even Chaucer. You know, it's ridiculous. Even reading Shakespeare in the original spellings. I mean, if you read it, it sounds the same, but in the original spellings, like the word for boots is B-O-O-T-E-S. Okay? So, even that's difficult, okay? So here's the deal. Don't compare it to English, because it has changed a lot. A person pointed this out one time. When Caesar marched into Egypt and saw the pyramids, those pyramids had already been standing the same amount of time as between us and Caesar.
Longer than that even.
Probably, yeah.
The pyramids
So
were around when Abraham was.
Yeah. And Abraham is at least 2,000, almost 3,000 years earlier than Caesar. Okay? So, some of the pyramids, not all of them. So the world that Caesar was in, even, was ancient. I mean, the world he was seeing was ancient. Okay? So now I'll take that and move it up even further. But the thing that somebody pointed out to me was, over time there is a contracting of advancement. So in the ancient world, things advanced very slowly. But the further into time you get, things advance very quickly. So you think about how far we've come since 1947, when some of the first microchip technology starts coming out, and so on and so forth after World War II, and how far we are now. That's only 50 years later. Or one of my personal things to point out, you know, there's this thing called hieroglyphs, and the Egyptians also had a non-vowel-based system, a lot like the Hebrew language. So they had the written language, and they also had the hieroglyphs. And we developed phonetic language with the Greeks. Now we have vowels, now we have consonants, we got great grammar and syntax and all that stuff. And what are we doing? We are de-evolving back into hieroglyphs and shorthand with texting. Because I have emojis and BRB and LOL. You know, and we're devolving back into that, right? So the advancement and progression of things tends to speed up over time. Back during this time, the trick is, I'm sure there's progression of the Hebrew language, but if you go try to learn Hebrew, what they're going to teach you is, what does the whole body of 1,000 years worth of Hebrew language, how does it work as a whole? Not, how did it work in Moses' day, now how does it work in Malachi's day? They're not going to teach you the nuances, they're just going to say, okay, here's what Hebrew does, and here's how you read it. They're not going to treat it as though Moses' writing is different than Malachi's. It is, but the nuances are there for people in the ivory towers that are way better at it than we'll ever be. Now the New Testament, big difference. Okay, so Alexander the Great spoke a form of Greek called Attic or Classical Greek. That's not the kind of Greek that the New Testament's written in. Because, like for instance, someone who moves to the United States who speaks a different language, Spanish is our kind of catch-all for Texas, their English is going to have a tendency to be a much more simplified English. And if there weren't a lot of English speakers around, and that continued for a long time, English would start to, I don't want to say de-evolve, because it's not a bad thing, it's just changing to be a less complicated, nuanced, sort of Shakespearean kind of language. It just naturally happens. Same thing happened with Greek. Alexander conquers all this world. Well, they don't speak Greek. And they're certainly not going to learn all the nuances and intricacies of Homeric Greek. So they learn a simplified version that can go all across the Mediterranean and Asian world called Koine Greek. And that's the Greek that the New Testament's written in. So it's a simplified. Yeah, if you learn classical Greek, you can read New Testament Greek. But if you just learn New Testament Greek, you're going to have a hard time reading classical Greek because it is much more. Luke, this is why I didn't like translating Luke for tests. He actually writes more like a classical Greek writer, just because he is Greek. He born speaking it and writing it. It's not that hard for him. But that's why these texts are so important. The Dead Sea, it represents a good transmission history, but the Greek text represents a Hebrew text that probably better represents a more ancient form of the Hebrew text, and it's worth listening to. It's not always right, but it's worth listening to when we come into textual critical problems. Yeah, we've already talked about that. All right, so the New Testament, the apostles and disciples are writing. The apostles and their approved associates, we've already kind of talked about this in canon, manage the writings of Scripture, primarily written in Koine Greek. I just explained how that worked. Koine just means common. It's just a Greek word for common Greek. Simplified Greek, there's a lot less weird. You get a lot less like particle words, like little two-letter words that just kind of get splattered all over the text in classical Greek. That sort of thing. There's other nuances and things. You also get changes in spelling. The old Greek term for heart was kradia, but the Koine word is cardia. That's where we get our word cardio from. But the old way of spelling was kradia, not cardia. So little things like that. But the only text that is the exception, but obviously the inspired version is in Greek, is Matthew. When the Apostle Matthew wrote his gospel, when he first wrote it, according to the historical accounts, he wrote it in Hebrew first, then translated it into Greek. And it's the Greek form that is part of our canon, that is the inspired form. Okay? All right, so, I should mention, this is the oldest copy of the New Testament we have. It's on a piece of papyrus. It's from the Gospel of John. It's written between the New Testament itself, not this papyrus. The New Testament is written between about 40 AD to 95. 95 is when Revelation is written. 40 is when Galatians and James are written, thereabouts. Well, I take that back. I think Matthew's Gospel is written somewhere around 40. It's 48, 49 that James and Galatians are written. Because James and Galatians are kind of dealing with the same sort of issue that's developing in the church that leads to the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. The earliest fragment of the manuscript we have in the New Testament is from about the year 125, and that's this guy right here, P52. P just means papyrus, okay? Because they're not always written on papyrus. Sometimes it's on vellum. But interestingly, it contains John 18, I think the passage is in, Are You King of the Jews? Passage is where that is on the front and back. So here's the deal. We have fragments of all of the New Testament, which range from about 125 to 350. By the year 350, we have fragments represented from every single New Testament text, which means they exist. Now, we don't know necessarily what all of them said prior to that, just based on the physical evidence. But we've got representations of all those texts by 350. Okay. Then we get to Codex Vaticanus. I don't want Vaticanus. I want Sinaiticus. There we go. Sinaiticus is the oldest full copy of the New Testament in Koine Greek. Okay? Copied between 330 and 360. The copy we have is from about 400 to 450, somewhere in there. And you can look at it online, too. I mean, you can look at every single page. Vaticanus is not far behind it. I don't know, they seem like they're in backwards order. I'll double check that. Both of these are very ancient, 300, 400. They're the first full copies of the New Testament that we have. So, the material helps to determine date and region, too. This helps us, so I should answer this. You are probably wondering how we know where they came from. How is it we know that someone didn't take a piece of papyrus, cut it with a pair of scissors, light the sides of it on fire, dip it in coffee, and look, it's a 2,000-year-old manuscript, right? But we look at several different components. Is it made with papyrus? First of all, that's the oldest form. It doesn't hold up well outside of Alexandria. Vellum, I'm not sure what all vellum is made out of. Parchment, I think, is made out of skins, animal skins. Scrolls, paper, codex. Paper is very expensive back then, so you don't really do that very much. Codex was a very new invention even in the 1st century. Codex is just a book where the pages are bound on one side. It's a book. The style of writing also determines the age. What kind of script are they using? Because eventually scripts go out of style. Are they using Paleo-Hebrew or modern Hebrew? I say modern Hebrew, later Hebrew, Aramaic letters. Are they using majuscules or minuscules? You're probably wondering, what are majuscules and minuscules? I don't know. I'll show you in just a second. For the New Testament, we have somewhere around 6,000 manuscripts available to us, ranging all the way up to about the year 1300. 6,000. You're going to see how significant that is here in just a little bit. 24,000 manuscript pieces we have available to us. These numbers are being added to every year. This has not stopped. When I was in seminary, the number, that top number was 5,700. And now we're at 6,000. And that was 10, 15 years ago. Okay, so majuscule is where you use capital letters to write the Greek, and there's no spaces between words. Minuscule is kind of a cursive Greek writing system. This is earlier, and this is later. And we know about when people actually started using the cursive script, so we can date it off of that as well. Do you recognize this? Pater, Hagias, Theto, to anima, su. Father, hallowed be your name. Your will be done, your kingdom come. It's the Lord's Prayer. So, anima, O-N-O-M-A, means name. And this is su, your name. I have no idea what that is. I can't read minuscule. I never could figure out how to read this. It's very complicated. Other methods of transmission, citations by early church fathers. We mentioned these guys. Clement, Irenaeus, Papias, Polycarp, all these guys, they would quote from Scripture. They would write it down. Okay, there are no verse citations, remember? So if they want to cite something, they actually have to write it down. They can't just say, oh, well, in John 4:3, it says this. No, they actually have to write John 4:3 down. Now, here's the crazy thing. Let's pretend like every manuscript of the New Testament was suddenly lost, gone. We could reconstruct the entire New Testament just from the quotes from the early church fathers. Every inch of the New Testament we could reconstruct. They were 86,000 citations. And we probably have some ones where we'd be able to cross-reference to see if they have the same citation. So, yeah, and diaries, books, and letters they wrote to each other, and liturgies that they used for worship. All these sorts of things. We could reconstruct all of it without even one single New Testament text. And this is to say nothing of the 15,000 copies we have, translations into other languages like Syriac, Latin, Sahidic, Bohairic, Egyptian, Armenian, Gothic, Georgian, Ethiopic, Nubian. The list goes on. And these are early translations, very early. Okay? Especially the Syriac. Syriac was very, very early on. And Syriac, Sahidic, Bohairic, and Latin were some of the earliest ones. Okay, so this is the chart. This is the money right here. Okay? Scholars trust what Homer wrote in the Iliad, right? The manuscripts we have, Homer, nobody's saying like, well, Homer really didn't write that. We don't know what Homer wrote. No one says that, right? Okay, well, how many manuscripts? Well, let's see. When did Homer write? Let's find Homer here. Homer wrote 900 BC. Okay? The earliest manuscript we have of Homer is from 400 BC. A span of 500 years, and we only have 643 copies. Or let's take Caesar's Gallic Wars. Julius Caesar wrote several things. He recorded them between 144 because he got assassinated in 44. Dates the earliest manuscript we have of any of Caesar's texts from 900 AD. A span of 1,000 years, and we only have 10 of them, but nobody questions what Caesar wrote. Of course Caesar wrote that. Duh. Plato lived between 427 and 347. Earliest copy we have of his text, 900. A span of 1,200 years, and we only have 7 copies of his text. But nobody questions what Plato wrote, right? I'm thinking, what's another good one? Herodotus. I'm reading Herodotus right now. Awesome stuff. You guys know the movie 300? Mm-hmm. Okay, so Herodotus is the one who records a lot of the history about 300 that we actually base the movies off of, right? So Herodotus lives between 484 and 425. Earliest copy we have of his text is from 100 AD. In the span of 600 years, we only have 75 copies. Who else do you want to talk about? Aristotle, 384 to 322. Earliest manuscript we have from that is 1100. Because the Muslims sacked areas that Christians were in and ran off the Christians, but got the Aristotelian texts and translated them into Arabic, and then taught themselves Greek philosophy and mathematics, and then that was brought back to Europe during the Renaissance. Span of 1400 years, we only have 40 copies, but nobody questions what Aristotle said, based on those texts. New Testament, written between 35 and 100-ish. The earliest copy we have of any New Testament is 125. 5 to 30 years for that first manuscript, but just like this is a little misleading because the total New Testament is represented in fragments by about 300, 350. That's only a span of about a couple of hundred years. And we have 50, that's actually, there you go, that's an old number. It's about 6,000. But the New Testament's been changed. It's been just totally messed up. We can't trust anything the New Testament says. You see the problem? The New Testament is the most well-documented ancient document in history, yet it's the one that gets a bad rap. I mean, the one that really kills me, I think, is this one with Catullus. He writes in 54 BC. The earliest copy we have is during the Renaissance, 1550. 1,600-year difference, and we only have 3 copies in existence. Yet no one's saying, I really don't think Catullus said that. It's been corrupted. You don't know what he said. But boy, everybody wants to go to town in the New Testament. That is foolishness. Absolute foolishness. So, we have excellent and reliable copies of the original autographs, okay? And the Bible is best scientifically attested to, is the best scientifically attested to in the ancient world, so that's a very convoluted sentence. It's the best document attested to scientifically from the ancient world, by far. All right, so any questions with transmission history and how that works? And I know I've been kind of knocking on the door of, okay, well, what happens when you got differences between the manuscripts? That's what we're about to do. But are we doing okay right now? Okay, this session's going to run a little bit long, but the next session won't be as long, and we'll probably still get out plenty on time. All right, so part 3, textual criticism. In this sense, criticism is not a bad thing. Okay? It's a good thing. It's just a process of being critical about the evidence and trying to figure out what the answers are. Okay? So, textual criticism is defined as just the art and science of comparing different readings of a given text. In other words, I have 2 manuscripts, and at like line 3, somehow there's a word difference there. Why? Or a misspelling or something. And I'm reading the 2 texts and seeing, so what I'm going to do is compare them, compare the different manuscripts based on the evidence that's provided about their history, their writing style, all the have you ever heard of the provenance? Ever watched Antiques Roadshow? Where did this thing come from? Whose hands is it traded over time, etc. All the information we can get to which one of these 2 is more likely to be the original reading of the text that the apostle or prophet actually wrote. Because something's not right here. So all the available manuscripts are compared based on date, geographic distribution, where were they found, what family do they fit into, textual tendencies. We actually have families of texts that tend to act alike, tend to have the same kinds of variants in those family groups. Genealogy, how they've been passed down, what texts are they possibly connected to, and other such matters to determine what is most likely to have been the original reading of the text. Now I want to be very clear because Joe brought up a really good question at lunch that I want to be clear about. I'm not going to suggest, and the process of textual criticism is not about saying, well, I think this should be in the Bible, but this shouldn't. I don't get to decide that. What we're trying to figure out is what was the most likely thing, most likely reading to have been recorded by the original author and manuscript. Does that make sense? It'll make more sense here in a little bit when I show you how to do it, but does that definition kind of make more sense? Okay, we're all drowning. That's fantastic. All right, here we go. The discipline came about because there are indeed variants, what we call differences between the copies of the New Testament and the Old Testament that we have. They're just differences. That happens because human beings took a pen and put it to paper and tried to copy something. It's going to happen. The thing is, what you're going to find is a lot of the mistakes and differences between them are completely inconsequential. I mean, really super inconsequential. But transmission is a human element to it. All right, so simply a difference in a variant is just simply a difference between two manuscripts. And there are two types. There's the unintentional mistakes that can be made and the intentional ones. What I mean by intentional is not that it's a mistake. It's intentional because I've purposefully changed it. Now, that can either be well-meaning or it can be ill-meaning. One of the two. And we're going to talk about those in just a second. Okay? So unintentional errors, things that could just happen when you're copying a text by hand. Mistaken letters, a handwriting issue. In Greek, there are certain letters that look very similar. In Hebrew, there are definitely letters that look similar. And as you're going along, and you don't know the language as well as you should, or you're writing faster, heck, you've been sitting at the table for 8 hours copying texts, and your eyes are tired, and you just miswrite a letter. The letter for D in Hebrew and the letter for R in Hebrew look almost identical. The R kind of swoops down, but the D kind of stops, backs up a little bit, and then goes down. It backs up like a little bit, and they look very similar. There's all sorts of different things like that, but it's just a mistaken letter. Oops, I wrote a wrong letter. That's easily resolved, no big deal. Homophony, substituting a similar sounding word or letter. The really great example of this is it's in Romans, and I'm afraid right offhand I don't remember exactly where at, but I'm just going to draw the letter so you can kind of see what the problem is. There's a place where Paul says something to the effect of we have or let us have is the way it's translated. This is we have, okay? Like I possess, I have something, okay? Echelman. And the alternative reading is Echelman. So it's either Echelman or Echelman. See the problem? Now we're all sitting in a room together, and I'm reading the Apostle Paul's letter, and you guys are copying it. And I get to the word Echelman. Is that Omicron or Omega? So this kind of thing just happens. You know, they hear one letter and they think it's one thing, and it's not. But there is a difference between this is we have, this is let us have. It's sort of a, come on guys, let us have this confidence, or let us have this idea in our minds. It's sort of a way of commanding something with it being participatory. So let's have trust in this. Come on, let's do this together. This just states the fact we have this confidence, or whatever the case may be. But that's a hard one. It's a very hard one. Not a big deal, though. Just unintentional and just what happens. Not a big deal. Tautography, repeated word or letter. So sometimes whenever you're reading through a passage, you'll get to where you see a word, and then you go down a little further and you see that same word. But when you write that word, you go down to write it, and when you look back up, you looked up to which one? The second one, and you continue on from there, and you drop that entire line in between. Okay, that's a simple mistake. It just happens. And what you do is you actually, when you look at the manuscripts, you can see the differences between them and see how it's even worse when that same word happens at the end of two lines together, and you just jump it, and you're like, oh crap, I missed the entire line. Fusion, combining letters and words. Oh yeah, you can get words that should be separate to have separate meanings that combine for whatever reason. Because remember, there's no gaps in the letters when you're actually writing the text, so you might get a misunderstanding there. I hate this word. Homoioteluton. The omission of the text based on a similar word ending. So just like how I wrote one word, but then I looked up and looked at the other siding of the word, what can happen is if one has a similar ending and another word has a similar ending, I can look up and mistake this word for one that's earlier and skip a whole bunch again. Again, just a mistake, didn't mean to. No ill intent. Metathesis, changing a letter or word order. You just accidentally put the words in the wrong order. See, the thing is, in Hebrew and Greek, word order kind of matters. It's called front loading. When you front load a word in a sentence that doesn't go in the right order that it normally does, you're putting emphasis on it. And so if you change that order, you can change the emphasis of the phrase. Again, not ill-intended, just accidentally put it in the wrong order. And liturgical additions. Everyone say the Lord's Prayer with me. Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Oh yeah, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. Yep. So, by looking at the available manuscripts, for thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever and ever, amen, is not in the text. So how does that happen? Well, some guy's writing his sermon one day, and he wants to include the Lord's Prayer in there as part of the liturgy that he's going to walk them through during worship. He gets done with that, and in order to transition back to his text, he adds a little liturgical tag, for thine is the kingdom, which is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But then some guy goes to copy that text later on into an actual manuscript, and what happens? He thinks that's part of the manuscript, and he pulls it in. Real simple. Not ill intent, just oops. But this is the vast majority of the variants and differences we see in the New Testament are these kind of problems. I mean, just split second, like, oh, that's all that is. This guy goofed up when he was copying. No big deal. Intentional errors, some well-intentioned, sometimes not. Okay? So the first one is pronoun substitution. This is perfectly well-intentioned. And the original text might have said something, and Jesus went down to here, and Jesus went, and Jesus did it, and Jesus did it, and so what's he going to do? And Jesus went down to the sea, and he, see what's happened? All they've done is they pulled out Jesus and put in the pronoun, or you might get the opposite effect. Oh man, I better clarify who this he is in this text. So I better put Jesus' name in here so they understand who's being talked about here, because we've kind of lost track. There's been a lot of pronouns. Again, well-meaning. No thank you, but well-meaning. This is one of the most common ones is pronoun substitution. Either putting a name in for a pronoun or putting a pronoun in for a name. Very, very common. Changes in grammar, spelling, or modernization of language. Very common. Again, well-intentioned. It's just updating. But when we're trying to have an accurate copy of what the text was, no thank you. Harmonization of passages, especially in the Gospels. Remember I told you about Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Very similar stories between the three. Sometimes what will happen is if a guy remembers a story from Luke and it's in Mark, and he goes over and he starts writing in Mark and he can't remember, wait a minute, over here in Luke I better include that too. Somewhat well-intentioned, but come on, you can't just be adding stuff in to harmonize. Theological additions. Anybody got a New King James on them? Or King James? What do you got?
The New King James right here.
Oh, excellent. Okay.
It's got a nubby next to it, so be careful.
Oh, it does. Is it dialogue?
It's parallel.
This will be a dialogue. We were talking about dialogue earlier, so international New King James. Oh, just that side. Cool. 1 John 5:7. So, is the Trinity in the New Testament?
No.
Not specifically the teaching, right? But wouldn't it be nice if it was? Wouldn't it? I think it would be delightful if there was yes, the Trinity is in the New Testament, but it's not explicitly, here's the Trinity. If you all would turn to 1 John chapter 2. Good old Erasmus. Well-meaning Erasmus. Alright, so 1 John chapter 2, verse 7. Brethren, I write no new commandment to you, but an old commandment which you have had from the beginning. The old commandment is the word which you heard from the beginning. Again, a new commandment I write to you. Why is this not lining up? Oh, I'm 5:7. Oh my goodness, my bad. Thank you. That doesn't make any sense. Let's go 5:7. Let's try that one on fast. All right, so let's start in verse 6. This is he who came by water and blood, Jesus Christ. Not only by water, but by water and blood. And it is the Spirit who bears witness, because the Spirit is truth. Okay. Verse 7. For there are three that bear witness in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one. And there are three that bear witness on earth, the Spirit, the water, and the blood, and these three agree as one. Guess what's not actually there in 1 John 5? The mention of the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit are not there. They have been added to have an actual Trinitarian teaching in the text. Okay? It wasn't there until the Middle Ages, the Renaissance. It got added. Specifically so that there was a Trinitarian teaching in the text. This I find to be a rather ill-intentioned addition. I don't need your help. I think I can figure out there's a Trinity in the New Testament. This kind of stuff happens. And it's aggravating when it does. I already brought up the liturgical edition. Sometimes that gets added in on purpose because they want to, and they don't care what you think. So, all right, so how do we decide? We got these texts in front of us. Okay, I've got like 5 texts here, and these 2 say this, these 3 say this. How do I decide? So here are the rules we follow. The shorter reading is preferred because the tendency is we want to add to rather than take away from. Now, just because it's shorter doesn't mean I'm going to pick it. It's just a general preference. Okay? The harder reading is preferred. Why? Because if it's hard, I wouldn't have made it easy to understand. They don't generally go from easy to understand to harder to understand. Okay? Goes the theory. The earlier reading is preferred. This one weighs a lot more to me because if it's seen to be an earlier text, I'm probably going to go with that over against something that's a 500-year later text. Okay? So if this text over here is from 1550 and this one's from 550, I'm going to have a tendency to go with that one over against this one, unless there's something qualitatively different about this one that makes me believe that this is actually correct. Wider geographic distribution. What this means is we have the ability to see kind of where a text was copied from. So there's the Alexandrian group. There's the Western group that's over in Rome and Western Europe. And there's the Byzantine group in kind of Asia Minor. They all have their kind of tendencies. They all kind of get grouped in together with families because they all kind of do the same things with their texts. They look similar. And the sort of differences we see with Western texts, they all seem to have the same differences against the Alexandrian text. Or the Byzantine texts seem to have differences that are very much the same as a group against the Alexandrian text. So we create these families. Well, the thing is, if I have one family that says this, but none of the other families say that, okay. Alexandrian does get preference because of it, because the Alexandrian is the oldest group. But if I see this reading here, I see it in Rome, I see it in the Byzantine Empire time, I see it all over the place, it's probably the right reading. It's probably the right reading that's gotten passed around to all these different places over time. The number of manuscripts also adds weight. If I have 30 that say this and I have 2 over here that say something different, Now, this one to me is the weakest argument. And the reason why is this. Over time, when you have manuscripts, what's going to happen with the older ones? They get torn up more, they wear, and the younger ones? Still around. So this is not necessarily, it depends upon the quality. Now, if the spread of the 2 different readings is from 500 to 1,000, and they've got representatives from the whole time period on both sides, okay, yeah, I'm going to tend to go with the one that seems to be a little earlier. But you got to be very careful with this particular rule because obviously there's going to be more of the later ones than there are of the early ones. Always quality eventually overrules over quantity. Always. Based on these preferences. Now, I will tell you, these are not hard and fast rules. Okay? Now, the reason I bring this up is not because I expect you to become textual critics, but I want you to understand when you read a text note on the side of your Bible where it says, oh, well, this text says this, and this text says this, and this is why we've chosen this reading, and why we think this is what was actually written in the text originally, you understand why they're doing that. You understand why they said that. Okay? And I'll try to read you one here in a little bit. So, the differences between the Old Testament manuscripts are generally of a minimal and little significance overall. They were very strict with their transmission and copying of the texts. There are differences, but they're just not as out of control. But the problem is that, for whatever reason, the Old Testament is just not as exciting in academia as New Testament studies are. So we just don't have, in fact, a lot of Old Testament scholars are very old and they're dying. We just don't have a lot of new blood coming in to study these things. So it's been very slow. We are projected to have a completed critical analysis of the total Old Testament by 2021. It's not even done yet. The New Testament one's been done for well over 100 years. So, but there are over 3,000 variants between all the available New Testament manuscripts, but I kid you not, literally 99% plus of those variants make absolutely no theological difference whatsoever. Because remember, I showed you pronoun changes, all that stuff. I mean, it doesn't make a difference. And the ones that the 1% less, or the less than 1% of the differences that do occur, that are significant in terms of doctrine, they don't affect any of the major doctrines that are of any note. It may change the way you look at certain things, but for the most part, they're not unorthodox doctrines at all. They don't change any major teachings. Okay? So now someone says, oh, the Bible's been corrupted. It's been changed. Really? Who changed it? Don't let them get away with that garbage. Who changed it? Where was it changed? When was it changed? What was changed? Why was it changed? How was it changed? Do not let people get away with that garbage. Oh, it's been changed over time, because they're just blowing you off. So, okay, well, what's been changed? Oh, I don't know, just things. Really? Well, that's not really evidence. They're just blowing me off. The Bible was not treated like a football going from team to team back and forth and people were messing with it along the way. That's not how it worked at all. We don't hide anything and we have nothing to hide. It's all out there for you to be seen. You want to go look at. Now here's the thing. I know what you're thinking. I don't know how to read Greek and Hebrew. That's okay, you can learn. Here's the problem. You're an American. Americans are very impatient. And don't want to put in the time and discipline and effort it takes to study Hebrew and Greek, and it's hard. It's not easy. But if you do it, then I showed you online. You can go look at Sinaiticus right now. That's a 1,600-year-old document you can go look at online. Every single page. I have nothing to hide. Go look at it. You can look at these things. One of the professors at DTS, Dan Wallace, he has a ministry. What he does is he goes around all these monasteries all around the world, all these libraries all around the world, and he takes digital photographs of every single page of manuscripts of the New Testament that they have available at their libraries. And so you can go to his website and for free, look at every single picture he's taken of every single page. It's pretty slick. Be gone with ye, little! Good, keep you on your toes. What is the deal? Oh, good grief, really? Java. Nobody likes Java. All right. Dare I ask any questions? Does this, I'm not expecting this to make total sense just yet, but does this at least make sense where we're going with it? Okay? Because when we actually get into doing the textual evaluation, we look at the text and suddenly see a difference between the text that we're working with, or a note comes up in the margins over this, you're going to be able to have a chance to say, okay, now let's work through this and explain this to me, and we can actually look at it. But remember what I'm not saying. I am not saying that we're deciding what the text of the New Testament should say or the text of the Old Testament. We are merely trying to figure out, based upon the evidence we have and the quality of that evidence, what the most likely original reading should have been. And please remember that when you compare all these texts together, we are super confident that over 99% of the New Testament is exactly as it was the first century when it was written. There's only those few minor, less than 1% things that we're still tossing and trying to figure out that make very little difference in major doctrines whatsoever. But the reality is this is just the issue we deal with whenever transmission is a human process. It's going to have these sort of mishaps along the way. But nothing should shake your confidence that this text is the Word of God. Does that make sense? Now, the next obvious question is, okay, let's talk about translation. Well, you get people who study Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic, and they work through it. They do the best they can translating and communicating that to you guys. And that's another form of transmission. And it's with errors, too. Translators have to make interpretational choices. It's just the way it goes. So, just understand, this is a trustworthy book. Don't be afraid of this thing. It can handle your weight. Okay? No matter how much weight you put on this thing, it'll be able to handle it. But just understand, I want you to have an understanding that this is not the original manuscripts written by the apostles and prophets. As long as you have a sober estimation of what this actually is, you'll be better prepared to handle it well. Okay? Cool? Right, and last preparation for our last session, we're going to look at how the Bible is Jewish meditation literature. This will prepare us for our last session. We're going to be talking about the literary types of books that we have in the Bible.
So the Bible is a collection of books written in different literary styles like narrative, poetry, and prose. And most of us are familiar with these kinds of literature.
Yeah, we all know a narrative when we see one, like The Hunger Games or The Great Gatsby.
And most people can recognize poetry, whether it's Walt Whitman or the songs of Bob Dylan.
And every day we're surrounded by prose and news articles or essays.
Now, all of these examples are modern American literature in that they came from this time period and this region of the world.
But there's also medieval English literature from another place in time, or ancient Greek writings from this place in time.
So each time period and culture produces its own unique kind of literature.
And in order to read the Bible well, we need to keep in mind that it comes from this part of the world and was produced in this basic period of time.
So what's unique about ancient Jewish literature?
Well, a key feature is that it lacks a lot of the details that modern readers have come to expect in stories and poems.
And this makes it seem really simple.
But actually, it's very sophisticated literature. Every detail that is given matters.
And that's great, but the lack of detail means that stories are often loaded with ambiguities. I mean, take one of the first stories, Adam and Eve in the garden. Where did this talking snake come from? And why did God allow him there? Why didn't Adam and Eve die on the spot like God said they would? And who's this offspring of the woman who will destroy the snake but is bitten by it?
Yeah, so many puzzles in this story. And some of these are questions that we have and that are not important to what the author is focusing on. But some of these ambiguities are intentional.
Intentional? Won't that lead to bad interpretations, people filling in the gaps with their own answers?
Well, that's a risk the biblical authors took in writing this way. We all tend to impose our own cultural assumptions onto the Bible, but they apparently thought the risk was worth it. These oddities are really invitations into an adventure of reading and discovery.
What do you mean?
Well, for example, the strange promise about the offspring of the woman crushing and being bitten by the snake. That word offspring is a clue to pay attention to genealogies, which, lo and behold, run all through the biblical narrative. They trace the lineage from Eve all the way to King David and his offspring. And in the New Testament, Jesus is connected to the offspring of this royal line. Now, when you read the prophets, Isaiah connected this king to the suffering servant who would die on behalf of his people. And then, in the book of Revelation, there's this symbolic vision. And can you guess? It's about a woman and her offspring. It's Jesus and his followers who conquer the dragon by giving up their lives.
Yeah, so each part of the story there is loaded with ambiguities, but altogether, it makes sense.
And this is the literary genius of the Bible. It forces you to keep reading and then interpret each part in light of the others.
This is feeling complicated. I don't know if I can do all that.
Well, you're actually not expected to notice all of this by yourself or all at once. This dense way of writing forces you to slow down and then read carefully, embarking on this interactive discovery process through the whole biblical narrative over a lifetime of reading and rereading.
Ah, okay. Meditation literature.
Yeah, in Psalm 1, we read about the ideal Bible reader. It's someone who meditates on the scriptures day and night. In Hebrew, the word meditate means literally to mutter or speak quietly. The idea is that every day for the rest of your life, you slowly, quietly read the Bible out loud to yourself, and then go talk about it with your friends, pondering the puzzles, making connections, and discovering what it all means. And as you let the Bible interpret itself, something remarkable happens. The Bible starts to read you. Because ultimately, the writers of the Bible want you to adopt this story as your story.
So this ancient Jewish writing style, it must create unique types of narrative and poetry and discourse.
Yes, and we'll explore all of those literary styles starting next with biblical narrative.
Yeah, there's a translation thing here. I already basically covered this, so just understand that it is not an infallible process to do translations. So, any questions on all of that? That is the worst of it for the day. You can handle it so far, you're in business. Doing okay? All right. So we're going to take a 15-minute break. Next session is not too long, and it's a little more straightforward, and frankly, it's probably one of my favorite sessions for this course. So.